So, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Delighted to have you on this call. My name is Julian Barnes-Dacey. I'm the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And I'm really happy that we can come together to do this conversation to mark the launch of this new paper that we've just put out, Alone Together, How the War in Ukraine Shapes the Russian-Iranian Relationship, authored by my colleague, Ellie Geranmayeh, who's a deputy director of the ECFR MENA program, and ECFR visiting fellow, Nicole, Grajewski, and really delighted that we can unpack this very important, timely issue as we look at the world in view of the invasion of Ukraine, as we look at dynamics globally, but also in the Middle East. I think it's quite clear that the nature of this relationship, the evolution of this relationship, has a lot of very critical implications, both for what's happening in the region on the nuclear file and in Ukraine, but also it raises questions more broadly about the kind of shifting global order and how Western actors, and for us Europeans in particular, can respond to that. So I'm delighted that we have both Ellie and Nicole here with us on the call to offer thoughts on their paper. We've also got Farzam Dilfasila, the visiting professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the Graduate School of Economics and International Relations with us, and Henry Rome, a senior fellow at the Washington Institute of Near East Policy in Washington, D.C., and they're going to be offering comments on some of the issues raised by the paper. Before we get stuck in, just let me offer a few housekeeping comments. This is an on-the-record conversation, but it's not going to be live streamed. We're going to try and post it as a podcast of sorts later. I'm going to start by drawing on the expertise of our four guests, digging into the paper, but also some of the issues raised by the paper. And then I'm hoping that we can open this up to a question and answer. So for those of you that are joining the call, and if you do want to come in, can I ask that you use the question and answer function at the bottom of the screen, or the chat function, to pose questions as we go along. Your questions will just be seen by me. I don't need to name you, so it's quite an easy means of posing your thoughts and questioning the speakers. As I say, I'm hoping we can have quite an open and free-flowing conversation here. There are lots of important issues on the table. And I do want to try and keep this to the hour that we propose. So without any further ado, why don't I go straight to you, Nicole? Nicole, you're one of the co-authors of this paper. We're really grateful that you've been on board as a visiting fellow with us, and you know this relationship very well. You spend a lot of time studying it. So maybe you could just kick us off by giving us an assessment of some of the main issues and themes that you've taken from looking at this relationship. What do you think are the key findings that you'd want to lay on the table in terms of how observers and policymakers should be thinking about the evolution of this relationship?
Oh, of course. Well, first off, I just really want to thank ECFR. This was such a lovely opportunity, and Ellie was an amazing co-author, and I think this paper brings out a lot of very interesting developments that have happened as a result of the war in Ukraine, but also touches on the evolution of this relationship. And one thing that does seem quite apparent is that the war in Ukraine was a catalyst for this relationship in many means. Whereas there was many already foundational sides of this when it came to common discontent towards international order, towards certain domestic political developments, the war in Ukraine really accelerated this relationship. And we see this both in the political sphere and also in the economic sphere. Partly because of their international situation, Russia and Iran have started to collaborate more on areas that were previously quite weak in this relationship. But one thing that we see, and it's quite prominent when it comes to concerns within Europe and also within the United States, is this military dimension of the relationship. And that's one area where there is a stark transformation. Before the war in Ukraine, Russia was previously the one who supplied Iran with weapons and armaments. And now we see Iran supplying Russia with drones, with equipment, and potentially with more advanced technology than before. So this has changed the dynamics of the relationship in that, and that's really apparent. In the economic sphere, Russia and Iran have been cooperating more closely on areas that they've often spoken about cooperating on. So de-dollarization and trading in their national currencies is one area. And additionally, both within Russia and Iran, there are domestic developments that seem to be running in parallel with each other. And this happened prior to the war. I think that this is something that you see both in Russia and Iran that was forming, but because of the war and also because of previous experiences in Syria, Russia and Iran really were able to kind of work together on capitalizing on this kind of shared developments domestically, where you see the rise of hardliners and individuals who are more antagonistic towards the West, and using that kind of as a starting point to really develop this relationship. So there's a lot of things that this paper touches on, but we broadly tried to look at where it was going, but also the foundations to this, and so where it started from in the first place.
Thank you very much, Nicole. And if I could just kind of push that a bit, I mean, what's your sense? You talk about the military relationship. What is your sense in terms of the kind of broader strategic nature of this relationship? Is this something that is still quite transactional and they're both serving each other's military purposes in the short term? Or have you kind of sensed that this has moved into something deeper and wider that has broader implications beyond that military linkages?
That's actually something we talk about in the paper. Is Russia has historically been quite averse to calling this relationship a strategic partnership, partly because it doesn't want to antagonize countries like Israel or countries in the Persian Gulf, but also because it doesn't want to be bound to Iran in terms of some kind of mutual defense pact, for example. But this is a flexible alignment. I mean, I think that there are a lot of things that are deep when it comes to their visions or their kind of aspirations for the broader processes of international order, but there's also a deep-seated sense of mistrust. And especially when the Iran side of this paper really shows how Iranian elites still don't quite trust Russia, how there are still a lot of legacies of the past, and they're not really open to some of the intentions that Russia has. So it is in many ways malleable and flexible, but that's the way I think it kind of functions by design, is that Russia and Iran are able to work in areas where there are common areas of concern or common interests, but also avoid the kind of areas of tension and kind of work more towards where they actually have synergies.
Great, thank you. And I think we'll probably want to come back to you both on kind of some of the respective elite thinking within the two countries and some of the specific issues at play here. But Ellie, let me come to you for some initial reflections. You know, we're a European policy think tank. We're thinking about you know, how Europe engages with the world. What is your sense in terms of how Europeans should be thinking about the nature of this evolving relationship? You know, are these two weak, isolated states that frankly Europeans don't need to be concerned about whether or not they're getting closer? Or is this something that Europeans need to have on their desks and need to be figuring out and thinking through an adequate response in terms of responding to the growing strategic or non-strategic closeness that is emerging?
Thank you, Julian. And let me also reiterate my thanks to Nicole, who I learned a lot from in the course of researching this paper, and also the great number of interviewees that we managed to have access to both inside Iran and Russia and across Europe to get insight into the thinking on the ground. So from the analysis we did and from the discussions we had with European policymakers, who by now, you know, in any meetings that I have, you know, Russia-Iran relations is now on the top of the agenda, whereas, you know, backtrack 2 years ago, it would rarely come up as a major priority issue. And I think here we have thought about some near-term objectives where this deepening relationship between Russia and Iran is posing the biggest threat for Western interest. And we have recommended that the Europeans need to work with the US to put the brakes, to slow down this relationship, understanding that they're not going to be able to halt it altogether, but that there are ways that they can reduce the partnership in strategic areas of interest to the West. The first here is whereby to reduce Iranian transfers of more sophisticated weapons to Russia that are likely to be used in Ukraine. And here we're not talking about the deals that have already been done for drones that are being used on regular basis to destroy Ukraine, but actually more lethal drones and potential transfer of missiles. The second thing that should really concern the West is that Iran advances its nuclear program with tacit Russian approval, and in some cases actually encouragement, and we can come back to unpack this. And the third area that we've highlighted is that this partnership on the military scale spills over into places like Syria, which might become a theater for increased escalation, particularly with the United States. And what we have said in the paper is that the US and Europe need to work together on both calibrated pressure tools to push back against this relationship, but also calibrated diplomacy to put the brakes on it. On the coercive front, the areas that we have flagged in the paper is firstly to push back against the drone development that's happening between Iran and Russia that looks like it is on a advancing track. Here we have looked at potential areas for restrictive measures and export controls that could be brought in actually against third countries that are exporting dual-use technology and components to both Russia and Iran. We have also recommended that the so-called E3 that are still part of the nuclear deal with Iran and the US work with like-minded Western countries to retain missile and drone-related sanctions on Iran. And last week, the E3 did come out to say that they did plan to retain national-level restrictions here. But we think that a broader net is required of countries to do this. The third area, which is more broader to do with the intensifying relationship between Iran and Russia, is to enhance intelligence cooperation and exposure at the right time of this cooperation. And this is really to influence the public debate and the elite debate inside Iran about where their relationship with the aggressive Russian partner is going inside Ukraine. And we can come back to unpack this, which is, for me, one of the most fascinating parts of the paper, is looking at the domestic debate inside Iran. And fourth is to the one area that we wanted to flag on the coercive measures actually is to also set some limits and calibrate this, because one thing that did concern us is the push for a much more coercive, sabotage, kinetic response to this inside actually Iran, to push back against the relationship. And actually, in our assessment, that was likely to lead to greater escalation from Iran in places like Ukraine, to reciprocate and hurt and put pressure on European interests. And also, it was likely to galvanize more support for a hardline response from inside Iran across the board. And Julian, I'll just also touch on the diplomatic tools, which I think is now there has really been an opening for this, given the latest de-escalation momentum with Iran and the West over recent weeks and months. And, you know, if in the past we used to look at Russia as the weak link in this relationship between Russia and Iran to negotiate, for example, over delaying the sale of S-300 missiles to Iran, or taking a much more harsh position on Iran when it came to the nuclear file, I think right now clearly is, you know, the West is in a position where it cannot cut deals with the Kremlin on Iran in the feasible near term. But with Tehran, there is both an opening now and also a debate at the highest level of the leadership inside Iran, which we might be able to influence. And the trade-off in that diplomatic endeavor to put the brakes on Iranian partnership with Russia in the core area that I outlined at the beginning is still going to be it's going to be an economic trade-off in return for security measures from Iran. And that, again, cuts across both areas of cooperation in Ukraine, but also nuclear, and in places like Syria, where escalation could ramp up between Iran and Russia against the West. And in exchange for that, we have outlined that the West can offer Iran immediate and more tangible economic relief than its Eastern partners like China and Russia have been capable of doing. And, you know, we set out the stats in the paper of the trade that's being done between Iran and all of these major other powers, and it's clear that those relationships are falling short on key areas of economic economic trade that Iran is after right now, after years of crippling maximum pressure sanctions. So here we identify a couple of areas where there could be a more immediate give from the Western side. And I'm sure Henry's going to go further into these areas of how realistic this is. But in our view, for example, allowing Iran increased oil exports, which also help the West reduce oil prices. Secondly, and more importantly, I think here for Iran, giving access to its oil reserves. And here there are ways to limit this to humanitarian trade, just as we've seen in the latest detainee release deal between the US and Iran. A third area where we think there's actually a clear European give here is on a more attractive grain deal with Iran that it's getting from Russia. Iran currently imports huge amounts of grain because of domestic environmental issues in the country. And here Europe could step in here to reduce Iran's reliance on Russia. And finally, the West could use the thaw that we have seen between the GCC states and Iran, particularly after the normalization deal between the Saudi Kingdom and Iran, to actually push forward some new ideas for economic gifts to Iran that were not there before. I'll end on a final note to say that the paper does recognize that this approach on the diplomatic front comes with several risks, including on the human rights component. I mean, it's not lost on us that this is all coming in at a time when the Iranian authorities have an incredibly repressive hand on the domestic front. But we think there are ways for the West to continue shining the spotlight on human rights abuses and holding the Iranian authorities accountable, as well as providing tangible support for activists on the ground, while trying to dent the Russia-Iran cooperation in areas that are of strategic security threat to Europe and the United States. And really, the paper ends by projecting this notion that the moment to influence the Russia-Iran trajectory is now, because the more that this continues through particularly the Ukraine conflict, the more likely it is that particularly the hardline security factions in both Russia and Iran have a codependency on each other and cement that relationship across the board. So over to you, Julian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellie. And yeah, I guess we should note that the Russian defense minister was in Iran yesterday, and so clearly that relationship is for the moment only going one way. Let me just ask you one question, Ellie. So you talked about unpack and some of the questions that we lay on the table. I think outreach that might be kind of still Tehran from Russia. And you laid out some of the things that the West and Europe put on the table. What would be asked of the Iranians in that context? Is this, the ties with Russia absolutely, the defense relationship? Obviously, at the moment, a lot of focus on hostages and the nuclear situation. How do you assess what the ask should be in terms of what the Iranians would need to give to open up the potential economic relationship that you're talking about, and how would you use that to peel them away?
Thanks, Julian. I think a lot of us lost you during that, but we got you back at the end of the question. So my understanding was, what does Iran have to give in order to pave the way for that economic quid pro quo from the West? So we thought a lot about this, and what the framework we have in mind, really, unfortunately, we don't like to think about very short term in think tanks, but right now I think the political reality is that we can really think about the possible framework between now and the next US elections in 2024. So our idea was, what are the realistic incremental measures that both Iran and the West can take before potentially there is an opening for more tangible gives on both sides after the next US elections, and clarity is there on where we're headed for the next 4 years. So on the Iranian side, we have said that the expectation should be that Iran halts the forms of military cooperation with Russia that are going to significantly enhance Moscow's ability to cause further destruction in Ukraine. And here we've really focused on the advancement of drones that could become more lethal in the course of cooperation that Iran may have with both Russia and Belarus here, but also this question of transfer of missiles to Russia. And we can unpack this because in our thinking, there seems to be a connection between whether Iran proceeds forward with the missile transfers and whether Russia is willing to give it the right price, which is likely to entail the Su-35 fighter jets. But we can unpack that with the panel later. The second area where we think there should be a demand made on Iran is that it caps and eventually begins to take incremental steps to roll back its nuclear program. So right now we've had a good hint that may be happening with the recent IAEA report on Iran's 60% enrichment of uranium slowing down, but we need to see much more evidence that that is actually steadily reducing in terms of stockpile. And also more, I think, pertinently for the West, it's to increase the access of international Atomic Energy Agency monitoring over Iran's nuclear program, which has actually just taken a hit over recent days because Iran has essentially announced to the agency that it's going to reduce the number of inspectors on the ground. And finally, we are in the Syria context, we are in a de facto stage of de-escalation, but we think it's important to actually make that a much more public, formal step that locks in this Iranian commitment and doesn't expose it to escalatory peaks, especially as we lead towards the US elections next year. So these are some of the areas of gives on the Iranian side that we've highlighted.
Very much, Ellie. One's internet always collapses as one's doing something live, so I'm hoping you can hear me and that I'm going to stay with you. And let me quickly go to Farzam. Farzam, you know Iran and the region very well. Love to get your assessment on the paper and how you respond to some of the analysis that's been shared, and then give us your thoughts on where you see the Iranian-Russian relationship going, the strategic or non-strategic nature of this, and what it could potentially mean for the West.
Thank you, Julian. Let me first start by congratulating Nicole and Ellie for a very wonderful paper. I recommend everyone who is listening and watching us to read it carefully, because that's a very interesting paper full of details and full of new information, I should say. I think if you let me, I would say that let me talk a bit more about the strategic logic behind Russia and Iran's current relationship. I think there are the two states under some sort of hybrid threat. You know, the regimes in both the states facing with a combination of a domestic problem and backlashes on both sides, and at the same time, you know, external threat that makes them insecure about their survival issue. That's the core of where the security elites in Moscow and Tehran are seeing each other. That's where they start looking at it at their own status in the global, let's say, position. They are under threat, so they see the relation possibly as a way, as a path that they can help them to resist this threat and sustain their situation. So basically, that means that if I don't want to go so theoretical argument here, but it's a sort of let's say protective integration taking place there. It means that both sides are together because they think there's a value in their security narrative by being together. By being together, they can secure their political systems, their regimes from possible threats of domestic or external threat. Each of them seeing it in different cases, but at the bottom line is this sort of a function of protecting each other. Iran sees Russia as an actor that can help it at some key security issues that it's facing, and now Russia is seeing the same way. So for this to happen, I think Moscow and Tehran are doing four major strategies. I mean, they have a, well, if I want to somehow give a sort of framework to what Nicole and Ellie have done in their paper, probably I can say that all of the things that we are seeing between Moscow and Tehran these days is going under four major strategies that both sides are doing. First is some sort of shielding each other from international pressure. You see that there's a clear attempt to prevent the other side being punished by the international system, or that's what we call isolation. That's what you may call, for example, Iran's counting on Russia to not being under in a very core argument of Security Council, not being at the pinpointed as a threat to global security. So somehow protecting itself from a kind of a consensus against each of these countries. So that's one major strategy. So sort of a political support, you may argue. The second narrative, or second strategy, I should say, is about sort of political solidarity and a strategic sympathy. I know that Nicole also wrote on that on other places, but that is a core thing. I mean, in the sense that both sides are seeing their view of global order, their view of the formation of threats at the global stage, very much closer to each other. You know, you may saw that in various sort of cooperations, for example, in countering what they call Western propaganda. So you see the cooperation on media and on public, on PR things at the very new levels that before that was not there, or some sort of, seeing each other as a victim of a Western, unilateralism. For example, for support of Iran, you may always argue that the Iranian leadership, especially Iranian leaders, Khamenei, he is very much feels a sort of a moral obligation to support Russia, because it sees Russia as sort of the same problem, being in the same, facing with the same problem that Iran was facing for the last 4 decades. At the same time, you see Russian position getting closer to Iran when it comes to understanding of, let's say, a global order or being anti-Western. So one very big issue here is how they see a sort of solidarity, strategic sympathy toward each other's political approach to the world. Another major area of cooperation, or let's say strategic cooperation, as I call it at this stage, I will explain that about your question, whether it's now strategic or it's getting to that point, is about exchange of knowledge. It's what we call in academics authoritarian learning. They're learning from each other's policies. There's a huge amount of exchange of information and exchange of know-how, which is basically, there are lots of examples, various of issues from policing, from in the report, the authors have mentioned, like the security on surveillance systems and controlling of the protests and so on. And you have the very formalized agreements that was signed in 2001 by Rouhani administration, even before the war started, that very much laid the ground for this sort of cooperations. You have it in sanction, learning, sanction evasion learning, that Russians are very much have very initially tried to learn from the Iranian side. So a big area of cooperation is where whatever they can learn from each other on their operation. You can go into the military side too. Like, for example, Iranians have learned a lot from American operation in Iraq. Now they're also learning from Russian operation, ground force operation, and other combined operations in Ukraine. So there's a huge sort of learning process in between, which the target is, by the way, as I said, securing the state, state security, bringing the resiliency to the state against the threat that they are commonly facing. And then the last point is about the security assistant, which, I agree with the authors that this security assistant for a long time has been from the Russian side to the Iranian, and now we are seeing this as a new pattern. But at the same time, we need to know that I think for Iran, losing the possible loss of the war by Russia would be costly. A weak Russia is not what Iran very much interested to see, because it will lose us, as we discussed. It's the political support that Russia can give. Powerful Russia that can have a sort of influence in international siege is something that at least Islamic Republic is very much interested to see. But There's also another point. Well, I agree that maybe we're not in this point of a formal military pact, but probably we cannot exclude that part of what Iranians did was a sort of attempt to signal Russians that in a face of a war, they are ready to support. So vice versa, if Iran faces with a similar situation, they expect Russia to support. So it's sort of, moving toward an informal pact that may help each other during a time of a severe military or security crisis. And we should not forget that, apart from being somehow Russia always source of supporting to Iran, Russia was the biggest supporter of Iran's military strategy in its very broad term. I mean, Iran's deterrence approach is very much supported by Russia. That means all of its critical components of its deterrence, which usually West has a problem, from missile to regional policies to even nuclear somehow threshold the state of deterrence. So what I want to say is that we're in a process or in a path toward having some strategic character in this relation. That strategic character in this relation is lied on the fact that the leadership on both sides seeing value, security value of this cooperation. Here is the core argument of mine, that when you have a security value in cooperations, it becomes very difficult to change it with economic gains. So that will be probably one thing that will somehow challenge part of the arguments that we have, because we need to argue that if really Iranians will be ready for economic benefit to give back the security benefits that they might have with Russia. And we need to not forget that Russia being consistent, it has been a consistent partner of Iran. I mean, I agree with the delays of Israel. Usually it's always argued about or criticisms that raised from Russia's, delays or exposure of information about, for example, their cooperation in Hamadan Air Base. But the truth is that, 3 decades, Russia being the only supporter of Iran's military in various forms, by supplying of end products, by supplying of technology, by providing operational helps, like, many doctrines, many operational doctrines of Iranian army has been coming from Russian sources. So basically how Russia supported Iran might have had some downs, or not so much in a linear way consistent, but in a strategic way it was consistent. It always happened without a major. So it's very hard if we may argue, or we think that Iranian leadership, especially Ayatollah Khamenei, for him, development and economy is always a secondary issue when it comes to security of the state, would be ready to give concessions for economic gains because of security arguments. So this is a whole picture I wanted to make, but just if
let me, if I may, Farzam, let me hold that thought there. I think I'd like to turn to Henry now, if that's okay, and get him to respond to that exact comment. Henry, you're sitting in DC, obviously a rather important place when it comes to Western policy on many of these questions. Give us your sense of kind of how you see this relationship, and whether or not there is space to wedge things open or not. And Farzam has put out some of the kind of economic security dilemmas that evolve from this argument. And maybe if you might as well, I mean, there's obviously a kind of de-escalatory track of some sorts underway at the moment. The US and the Iranians trying to keep a calm on things and prevent escalation. We see the hostage negotiations. Is there any sense in your mind that in DC that trying to get the Iranians to be less close to Russia is A, important, and B, durable?
Thanks, Julian. Thanks to ECFR. Some really good questions there. And just kudos to Ellie and Nicole for an excellent paper. Recommend everybody take a look at it. And good to be here with Farzam as well. And I do think I just did want to note that one of the great parts of the paper is it did a good job of, I think, explaining where there's room for growth in the Iran-Russia relationship and also where the constraints are. Because you often see articles that either go in too far in one direction or too far in the other. And I think it did a really nice job of articulating the balance. I think on the policy recommendations, just to zoom in on that a little bit, I think Ellie and Nicole deserve applause for thinking creatively about ways to incentivize Iran to do or not do certain things. And I think, and I agree with the premise that we do need to address the kind of full scope of Iranian behavior, and that doing so doesn't preclude Western governments having human rights concerns and addressing those separately and in tandem. I think one of my takeaways from the paper, I think there are a few kind of key challenges with the approach laid out, and would love to discuss this in more detail. And I think one kind of question, this dovetails off what Farzam said, is can we actually stop Iran from reducing military cooperation that is ongoing? And I think the stopping the transfer of ballistic missiles was, I think, a success for Western governments, or at least a partial success. I think there were a lot of factors that probably went into that, and they're addressed in the paper. But I do think surely part of it was the deterrent message from the US and European governments towards both Russia and Iran about what the impacts would be on their relationship, both in on the battlefield in Ukraine and also in the region. I do think, though, that compelling Iran to stop doing something that it's already doing is a much higher bar to meet. And so I think, just to kind of underscore what Farzam said, I think this is a formidable challenge, and I think Ellie and Nicole acknowledge that in the paper. I think looking at it from the US, from the perspective of where the US is right now, the kind of, I think there's a very low ceiling on what's really possible in terms of offering real incentives to Iran at this point, because they're operating in a construct where the administration wants to avoid any type of congressional review between now and the election. And I think to the extent that the administration would be interested either over the next year or if the president's reelected in doing anything in Congress with Iran, it's probably only going to want to bite that bullet once. And I think the risk is that kind of shorter term measures that cross that threshold into what would require congressional review kind of imply that the administration would need to go through this fight twice. And I think that's a pretty tough sell. And the sense that I get from the White House is that they're really only interested in one nuclear deal in the Middle East over the next year, and it's not the one with Iran, of course, reference to the negotiations with Saudi Arabia. And I think another concern that I have, and you hear this both from Iranians and Westerners, is the risk that kind of interim agreements of various kinds end up becoming permanent. And actually weaken the prospect of securing a more comprehensive agreement. And I think this is not just pertaining to our discussion today, but in general with the various de-escalatory steps the U.S. has taken towards Iran, such as not aggressively enforcing oil sanctions, allowing Iran not kind of hiving off the hostage deal for a moment, but allowing access to funds in Iraq, for instance. These are all things that make living without a deal much more manageable for Iran. And I think that simultaneously reduces Iranian incentives to reach, from an economic point of view, to reach the kind of either JCPOA or something comprehensive like that I would reckon everybody or most people kind of here and listening probably agree that we need at some point. And I think dovetailing with this is the challenge that Iran today, I think, is less isolated than it was a year ago, and certainly less isolated than it was a decade ago. The last time we did the kind of interim deal leading to comprehensive deal type framework. I think the relationship with China continues to deepen, although there are real constraints on that too. I think the Russia relationship has advanced in really notable ways. And I think, with all that in mind, I guess I would propose that if we're entering a conversation about a kind of smaller deal or a temporary deal, then I think the West should frankly ask for more, and it's from the non-proliferation side, especially just given the risk that this could be the new baseline, basically, that the West will be living with. I think just one other point, and I would love to hear Ellie and Nicole on this as well, and this is something that I found fascinating from the paper, is the idea of concern among Russian elites that a revival of JCPOA could lead to Iran turning more pro-Western. And I find this a bit peculiar. I don't doubt that this is a view, but I just find it peculiar because I think looking at the Iranian government today, it looks like the risk of it going pro-Western is not exactly a real concern. But I was fascinated by that kind of thread in Russian thinking. And if we have time, we'd love to hear more about that as well. So thanks again for the opportunity.
Henry, thank you very much for those valuable thoughts. And I've got several questions coming into the Q&A in the chat, and I want to try and come to all of you with different thoughts. I'm going to ask you to be brief and to try and just give some sharp answers to questions. But Nicole, let me go straight to you. Henry talked about thinking in Russia. Other people are asking me about that. What is your sense in terms of how the Kremlin sees the Iran relationship and where it could be going? What do they want from it? The extent of, which way is dependency flowing here? Implications for weapons transfers and the nuclear deal. I mean, just would be great to get your thinking on how the kind of trajectory of the relationship and who's giving who what are bouncing around the Kremlin.
Yeah, so actually, I have an upcoming chapter in one of Farzan's edited volumes that looks specifically on Russia's elite thinking towards Iran, but the article does, or the report does contain a lot of kind of more looking at it more in a broader sense. But to really go in depth of Russian kind of decision-making in elite groups, it's difficult, and there's a lot of inconsistencies, and I think Henry brings up one of them, is that there is a fear in Russia that potentially Iran would, drift towards the West, and I think that actually roots in perhaps even the Khatami era, when Russia was actually quite concerned that Iran would potentially, try to have some more reconciliation with the West, because that does leave Russia in a position where it has less leverage over Iran historically. When Iran's endeavored to have rapprochements with the West, even if they failed, Russia has often seen this as a way that their influence would be decreased, just partly because Iran would have other options. And this is something that is even discussed today in Russia, that if Iran does drift towards the West, this would be dangerous for them. And we kind of go into that with the nuclear section, because for Russia, one of the things that has been historically an area where they've been able to play a pretty big role on issues involving Iran has been the nuclear file. And that partly has to do with Russia's relations with Iran, but also with its technical relationship. And so when we get into actually a lot of Russian elite thinking towards the nuclear issue, it becomes clear that there are these divisions. And one of the changes that has been precipitated from the war in Ukraine has been Russia's view of the Iranian nuclear issue, which is quite fascinating, about how before, there was a lot more skepticism towards Iran's potential militarization of its program. And now there seems to be a lot of acquiescence. For some of these elite thinkers, especially for the more hardline views, Iran with a nuclear weapon would be less threatening than a pro-Western Iran. And that's quite harrowing when you think about Russia's role in the non-proliferation regime. Obviously, these elites don't always reflect the decision makers, or they don't always reflect those in power, but they are surrounded, a lot of them, especially the more of those who reflect the security services in Russia, do tend to have a view of Iran that's more optimistic about the scope of Russia-Iran relations. And that's partly because they share similar threats and similar kind of senses of Western intentions. So there's a mosaic, I guess, in Russia when it comes to Iran. But it does reflect at many times this kind of, I guess, internal divisions within the country. And so sometimes you'll find economic elites more in favor of relations with the West and Russia, and consequently viewing Iran as kind of a sunk cost. Or you'll view the more hardline military establishments who are more open to relations with Iran. I think the war in Ukraine has actually changed some of these dimensions, and one of them has been the economic side. previously economic elites in Russia weren't so enthusiastic about reaching out to Iran. They didn't view it as much potential. But as one of our interviewees have noted in the report, there's a widespread change within the assessments of Iran's potential economically, whether it be import substitution or de-dollarization, these kind of measures that are perhaps will be achieved in the far future, or even if they are. But these are ways of Russia kind of reevaluating Iran in a way that they used to think about India and China. Like India and China were always in the Russian elite thinking, the two countries that would potentially be the ones that offset Western influence, and Russia can use its relations with India and China to become a bigger power, how it can use this to diversify relations. Iran's been essentially elevated to that level in a lot of these discussions. And I think that's one of the really fascinating developments, is how Iran automatically after this war became one of the main areas of intrigue for Russia.
Nicole, thank you very much. Ellie, I'm going to flip that question to you in terms of, you hinted at kind of intra-Iranian elite discussions and perhaps differences on the Russia question, and there's a specific question about, you know, the role of the IRGC here, and as they become more dominant within the Iranian system, does that further complicate the kind of any prospects of trying to wedge open space, or the West trying to wedge open space through the economic?
Sure. So, I mean, I think the trend we have seen from the Iranian side, particularly, I would say the hard security establishment inside Iran that has fostered the relationship with the Kremlin through the Syria war, is that they want a strategic alliance with Russia. Even Iran's supreme leader, 2 decades ago, talked about having this strategic alliance and pushing for it. And it's this geopolitical vision of pushing for a multipolar order that dents and immunizes countries like Iran and Russia from Western sanctions, but also Western pressure and this sense of an increasingly militarized Western posture towards them jointly. But on the other hand, you also have, I would say, even within networks of the IRGC that are more economic focus, there's this debate ongoing of, does the Islamic Republic of Iran want to muddle through each year for the foreseeable terms ahead, or does it actually want to develop economically and keep up, particularly with the rising, fastly rising GCC states, that are going to really overtake Iran's development in the region going forward. And actually, I think the title of the paper at the beginning, which is Alone Together, sort of summarizes why the geopolitical push and from some elements of the IRGC is pushing them towards Russia. But there is also this need and desire, I would say, from other factions within the elite, even a very hardline elite that we have today, of not burning the bridge down with the West, including Europe. And I think here the point that Henry made about why there has been a halt in the transfer of ballistic missiles from Iran to Russia is important, because I do think the pushback that they have received jointly from the US and Europeans on the gravity of the consequences for the relationship with the West has been heard, even again, I would say, with the most hardline establishment in place in the country here. So I think one of the real big takeaways for us in the paper is that the fact that Iran is still pushing for these incremental deals to be made with the Europeans and with the US, and we saw the breakthrough now with the detainee deal, I think is a recognition of the fact that they no longer believe that China, Russia, India can give Iran everything that they require on the economic front, even the security front, and that they need to hedge their bets against everyone involved. And I think this goes back to this idea that, Nicole and I had a lot of discussions about whether we should call this relationship as something that's heading towards a strategic alliance. But actually, I do think that we are seeing evidence even today that the two sides are willing to abuse and use one another as and when needed, and they prefer this flexible arrangement because at the end of the day, they still want to put their economic, their geopolitical interests first. And we've seen the trade-offs that Russia has been willing to make on Iran when there's pressure from Israel or the GCC states. And Iran similarly, I think, is trying to keep its options open with the West. Now, Where this goes in the coming 5 to 10 years is very uncertain, but this is why the paper sets out a sense of urgency that now is the time to influence that thinking inside Tehran before it cements in the very hard security thinking that we have seen accelerating this relationship over the past 2 years.
Okay, thank you very much. Farzam, can I continue along the same vein with you? You know, I think it's more obvious in the sense what Russia gets out of this relationship, given the Ukraine war and where we are in the world at the moment. What is your sense in terms of what Iran is really getting out of this? I mean, economically or on the security front? I mean, I think it's less visible in some sense, the material gains that Tehran takes from this relationship as the kind of balance of power shifts away from a more dominant kind of historical Russian position. From a kind of regime perspective in Tehran, what are they really looking to extract from Russia going forward to make this worthwhile and to kind of advance your argument that they're very unlikely to turn away from Russia at this time?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I should say, look, I think that as I said before, I think it's important that we see the decision makers, I mean, who are involved in Russia-Iran decisions, because I think Iran's foreign policy decision making is not a very homogeneous area of decision making. Basically, you have different files. In different files, you have different decision makers. And in each of these files, the players, the actors who are involved in it and prioritize the policies are different. For example, when you talk about nuclear case, you know, you have a broader actors who can, you know, even I can tell you that people from home can bring you some solutions. And I have examples for that, for solving, for example, the nuclear issue. But when you discuss with Russia-Iran relation, you know, the groups who are involved are more security elites who have a, you know, security mindset. And basically for them, that was my argument. And I think for them, the economic gain is a less thing, is a less priority. If you can add it, that would be perfect. And that's what they're trying to do, basically by, as the report mentioned it properly and precisely, they're expanding to other areas. But the key is that, you know, you can see that in the conflicts or conflicts of interest that happens between Russia and Iran. For example, one area is energy, you know, Syria, and other areas. When the disputes takes place, the logic that they resolve the dispute is that this relation for Tehran is critical. So even if it needs to give concessions, it will give concessions because the security value is higher. So what you mentioned, I refer back to my previous argument that, you know, all modernizations or all clear modernization, actual modernization of Iran's military, at least from the 1990s, took place with Russian assistance. Even Iran's current missile program, if you look at the very early stages of its development in the 90s and until 2005, 2006, there is a very clear involvement of Russian clandestine or even sometimes a state involvement in transfer of technology. If you look at Iran's, for example, underground missile cities, it's a completely Russian concept based on Iran's visit of Russian military bases in early 2000s. So the gains are very much on a specific area, and this specific area is not always open to public. So basically, we cannot very much clearly sometimes pinpoint the exact gains. But here, I would like to mention and bring up a very important point that I think the report has said about, and that is a danger of going toward a sort of escalatory European or Western escalatory response to Russia-Iran cooperation. It means basically adding to the threat against Iran for its cooperation with Russia. That is dangerous because basically it will add to the logic that this cooperation is based on. It adds to the credibility of the narrative of those people inside the IRGC and other security sector who argue that we need to work with Russia because Russia is an actor that can help us in making the Islamic Republic resistance to the pressure from outside. And basically, here comes a very important conclusion of the report. This is what I took from the report, is that any recommendation, any solution should be based on changing the calculation in Tehran about its future cooperation with Russia. If you look at the JCPOA, the success of the JCPOA was two-sided. It happened in Tehran. It was accepted because of two reasons, not just because of economic gains, because of its security gains. If you remember Rouhani's discussion when he was trying to sell JCPOA to the public and to the government, he said this deal prevented the war to come to Iran. This deal prevented Iran to become isolated power. So basically, there was a very clear assessment that Iran's role after JCPOA would be different. So what I want to say is that any long-term future to somehow slow down Iran-Russia cooperation relates to the fact that how we can probably make a concession by taking the security cooperation from Iran and Russia and adding or reducing the threat that Iran is receiving from outside. So basically, that's sort of a security balance between the level of threat that Iran receives and the level of security that it receives from cooperation with Russia is what probably can change the calculus of people in Tehran.
Thank you, Farzan. Having talked about the security side, I just do want to spend a bit more time on the economic side. And Henry, coming to you, the role of US sanctions and what that might or might not do in terms of this relationship. Do you see that as something which is pushing it in any direction? And kind of, do you have thoughts on linkages to the Arab Gulf states, to China, the kind of economic system and some of the kind of geoeconomic competition that we see emerging after Ukraine and as middle powers are kind of stepping up more?
Thanks. Yeah. So, I think both Iran and Russia obviously are facing extensive U.S. and European sanctions, although those sanctions are quite different, and it does tie back a bit to what Farzan was talking about in terms of the security elite willing to kind of eat the economic cost of the relationship. In theory, all Iranian oil exports anywhere in the world are contrary to U.S. sanctions, and anybody handling those exports is puts themselves at risk. That level of restriction does not apply to Russian oil, and it was quite a deliberate carve out that basically there are restrictions on importing Russian oil to Europe and the United States, as well as on using Western insurance and other services in transporting Russian oil to other countries. But there is no kind of similar ban, basically, on moving Russian oil. And I think this is important because it's actually created quite a bit of competition between Iran and Russia in markets like China, where, yes, Iran's oil exports have increased pretty dramatically, but they are having to compete continually with the Russians on the price of the oil that they're able to sell. We've also seen the kind of economic impacts of the war and of U.S. and European sanctions on other Iranian industries, such as steel, where Russia is now a major competitor to the main markets that Iran used to essentially own in terms of exporting commodities like that. So I think that on the economic side, there is quite a bit of competition and tension there, which is somewhat new. But I think, on the flip side of it, there are, of course, also efforts, and I see a question in the Q&A as well along this point from Jonathan, who's written a fantastic article about this, efforts to increase cooperation at the same time. And these are increasing basically in parallel and not exactly contradictory, where you have competition in markets, but also collaboration on ways to avoid Western sanctions. And these are trying to link the Russian and Iranian financial systems and payment systems, trying to develop new trade routes. So it seems that, and maybe this kind of underscores the maturity of the Iran-Russia relationship, that they're competing in some areas, cooperating in others, and it's not as though every single slight is a major, it puts at major risk derailing the relationship. It's just a multifaceted partnership.
Great, thank you very much. We are fast running out of time, but I want to pose one last question to Nicole. Hoping, Nicole, that you may be the right person for these questions, but we have a couple of questions related to what's happening in the South Caucasus at the moment, and kind of how Iran and Russia may have competing and overlapping interests there. We have a question on the Caspian Sea and the North-South trade corridor. Be interested to get your thoughts. These aren't really things you went into great depth in the paper, but do you have a perspective on how Russia and Iran may be approaching those different issues, and what it may mean going forward?
Yeah, so on the Caspian Sea, there's an interesting division and convergence between Russia and Iran. Historically, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Caspian Sea that was originally shared by Russia and Iran through a kind of like a condominium. So it was like basically split between the Soviet Union and Iran. The emergence of, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan in the Caspian Sea complicated kind of the division of the sea over its resources. And up until 98, Russia actually was on the same page with Iran. They wanted to go about the division with this. Russia eventually shifted to more towards the Kazakh and Turkmen line, and this caused a lot of tensions with Iran. There hasn't been a lot of agreement when it comes to the division, but there is a convergence between Russia and Iran on the provision that forbids the presence of any kind of foreign military in the Caspian Sea. This was actually first introduced under Ahmadinejad, and then the Russians supported it because they were quite worried about NATO essentially establishing a presence in Azerbaijan. So that was one thing that has been a convergence between Russia and Iran, is the presence of no foreign military forces. The Caspian is now becoming very important because Russia and Iran are essentially using the Caspian Sea to transport drones, but also other kinds of goods through the Caspian, mostly through Astrakhan in Russia. And this has also involved Russian and Iranian ships turning off their tracking systems or kind of spoofing and so reporting different locations for their ships. So that's one way that this is becoming important after the war in Ukraine. On Karabakh, there's historically a lot of differences between Russia and Iran, but also some areas also where they've converged. I think the role of Turkey in the war in 2020 was something that provided an area for Russia and Iran to oppose and also to work together on. The establishment of peacekeepers in 2020, Iran wasn't essentially enthused about what happened during that war, but there was discussions with the Russians about their presence. Iran does want to have a connection with Armenia. Obviously, what's happening right now, there is divisions between Russia and Iran. Iran had a military exercise, quite alarming military exercise a few months ago that caused a lot of concern with the Russians. And right now, what is developing with Nagorno-Karabakh, there's also that dimension where Iran actually has been quite supportive of Armenia. Russia has a different position towards Pashinyan and also towards Karabakh. And that's some kind of area of friction. This was discussed in Iran during the Shoigu meeting yesterday, but it's not a salient area or not like a major area of discontent in this relationship. There's clear differences, but it's not going to be like the nail in the coffin for the bilateral relationship. I think that's emblematic to it as well. It's like Russia and Iran don't get along on a lot of issues. There's a lot of differences, but there are more things that bring them together and more structural phenomena that bring them together despite tensions in regional areas.
Nicole, thank you very much for those final remarks. We've sadly run out of time. We could well go on for a few more hours, and I'm sure this is a conversation that we will continue at ECFR, that colleagues who have joined the call will continue in different fora going forward. I want to thank Henry, Farzam, Nicole, and Ellie for sharing their thoughts. And for offering a lot to chew on. Clearly this is a relationship that is deepening, that is widening with quite kind of important implications for the West in the region and beyond, but also it's interesting to note some of the kind of areas where there are mutual doubts, where there are kind of elements of competition. and to think what that could mean in terms of Western coercive and diplomatic approaches, I guess particularly towards Iran, given that the Russian relationship is so clearly cut off. I do want to thank Ellie and Nicole again and for the paper that they wrote together for ECFR. I want to commend that to you. I really recommend that if you haven't read it, that you go to our website, www.ecfr.eu, and find the paper Alone Together, How the War in Ukraine Shapes the Russian-Iranian Relationship. It's well worth a read, and there is a lot of really good analysis and food for thought there. But let me leave that with you. We've just run over slightly, but it's been a really rich and thoughtful conversation. And let me thank all the participants who have joined this. And I hope that this is a conversation that we can share more widely after this is finished. But thank you very much, everyone, and have a good afternoon and morning wherever you are. Bye-bye.